Hey everybody, today a lot of people have requested a standalone tutorial for edge banding, so that's what we're going to do. What is edge banding? Edge banding is this nice banding along the edges here of a piece of leather. Instead of doing a burnish, you basically just wrap the edges in leather. It gives a nice contrast, it looks very, very fancy, and we're going to go over how to do the edge banding itself by hand. This is not a machine tutorial. This is a little bit more of an advanced technique, but the way I'm going to show it to you, it's really not that hard. It's just a lot of lining things up. The only specialized things we're going to need, a strap cutter is nice, but you can just use a knife. And a skiving knife is nice. Knowing how to skive is great too, but you can just do a butt joint if you don't need it. Other than that, we just need thread. I'm using my signature stitching tool with buckle guy. The basic stuff. The first thing we're going to do is I'm going to grab a piece of, let's grab a piece of black here. So I'm going to grab a piece of black leather, right? I'm going to cut a curve in it just by hand to show you that you can do this around curves, no problem. Now the thing is, when you do something around a curve, you want to make sure the curve isn't super tight. So you can see on this bag, you can see this curve here looks nice and even. I didn't use any glue, and I don't use glue because it allows you to take these curves a little bit easier without getting a lot of bumps. Our first task, we're going to make our stitch line. I'm going to use a 3mm stitch line throughout everything. We're going to go down, we're going to go around our curve. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to punch. Now the most important thing is to keep your stitch spacing consistent. You don't want to be punching in between holes or anything like that. And honestly, you don't need to, because the edge binding itself is going to cover a lot of our spacing issues that we may have. You want to pick one point, and you want to work all the way around the piece when you're stitching your holes for the pieces that you want the edge binding to match. When I have a curve like this, I'm going to use my 2-prong. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out my stitches. I'm going to put the back tine in the hole that I made, and I'm going to press the front tine down to get the perfect stitch spacing. Now once we have our curve punched, I'm going to go back to my 9-tooth, and I'm going to punch the rest of this out. We'll just go to there. Next we have to cut our edge binding. We're going to want something that's about 2mm thick. What I like to do is I like to order the 2 square foot panels from Buckle Guy in a 2 to 3 ounce leather that I'm using for other stuff. And I just keep this one panel to cut my binding. Because I usually don't need stuff this thin for other parts of the bag unless I'm doing like a matching lining, but I like to do linings that show off that edge binding. So a lot of the times I want my lining to be a little bit lighter or darker than my edge binding itself. We have our 2-3 ounces of Wicket and Craig here. This leather is about 6.5 ounces. Figure once you skive and when you're making bags and stuff, that's about what your edges are going to be, but of course this may vary a little bit. When it comes to punching our binding, we don't need this 2-prong anymore. We only need our 9. I'm going to take the same 3mm stitch spacing, and we're going to go down both sides of this, because we're going to punch both sides. I like to make sure I have a right angle on one edge of my binding. That way I can overlap one of my tines and make sure that my stitch spacing is perfect, because we're going to do it on both sides and we want the stitching to be perfect across from each other so that we get even, smooth edge binding. Then I'm just going to work my way down. You can punch all one side. You might notice your edge binding bowing because it's a very thin piece of leather that you're essentially punching and spreading a lot of little holes in. So to keep it even, you can alternate sides. It's not necessary, but I do it. Now, this is going to be for a glue-free. We're not going to use any glue when we install this. You, of course, can use glue. When I use the sewing machine, I glue up my bindings because I don't have a binding foot attachment. And I think that'll be enough. If you're going to need an overlap or a joint, this isn't, say, a straight pocket, you got to figure out if you want to do a butt joint or an overlap. Now, an overlap looks like this, just a simple joint. You get one seam, and the butt joint looks like this. And then what I like to do is put a cover over top of it, but you don't really need to. If you see, the butt joint looks pretty good on its own. Because we're going to skive down one end of each of our pieces, or if this is one piece, we'll skive down both and they'll wrap around and sort of overlap like that. To start sewing, I'm going to crease my edge binding here. Now this leather is 6.5 ounces, simulates a basic skived edge of a bag or anything like that. You are going to want to measure and do a test piece to figure out, look, I have a test piece here, for example. This is a test piece of hair on hide with a 1.5 ounce edge banding. I just do little pieces like this before I get to the main piece to make sure all my spacing is right. Your spacings you're going to want to use, you're going to want to figure out what you want your spacing from the edge of your main body piece to the stitch line there is. You're going to want to figure out what the edge to the stitch line on the inside and the outside of your edge banding is. And then you're going to want to figure out the width of your edge banding so that these holes can wrap fully around your body and not stretch this piece too much. Because if when you go around a corner, if it's too tight, your whole piece will bow because of the tension of the thread. All right, so my hands are very large, and I can't show you this without just totally blocking everything. So I'm going to show you how I essentially start. I take one of my needles, I go through one part of the edge banding, the first hole in the body that I want to start at, the second part of the edge banding. Then I pull this tight, making sure both sides of the thread are even. Then I fold over the side of my edge banding, take my alligator clip, and just attach it like that. One thing, if you need to do it, if you need to go through just two pieces like this, then you can pick up that extra hole on the other side. Anything that makes it the easiest for you. And you can see we're kind of moving along here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull down my alligator clip a bit, put it further on. Don't worry about any marks. We're going to hammer this when it's done, so we'll hammer those marks away. You can see all we're doing is just kind of following along. Once you have some stitches in, it's fairly easy going. And what I'm going to show you next is how to do this overlap joint. So we skived on this end and we skived on that end there. It's going to be pretty similar to the way we started this one. I'm just going to put a little fold in this. I have my two needles here that have been threaded. And we're going to overlap probably about 2 stitches. It's all going to depend on how much you skived. So you can really, you only have to overlap 1. So let's try that. We'll overlap 1 stitch. And the key here is I'm going to go through with this needle. I'll move my hand here in a second and show you. I'm going to go through with this needle. See how everything can come apart? That's totally fine. Just pull. It'll all come right back into place here. But when I pull, instead of going forward initially, I'm going to take my back thread, the thread closest to the seam, and I'm going to go one off onto our other piece of edge banding that we already finished. And here we go. So our overlap is right there. You can see it's nice and slim because we did all that skiving. You can't really even see it. And then you would just continue. Obviously, this is the end of our sample piece, but you would just continue on. So this is a good way if you don't have a super long piece of edge banding, or you want to keep things, in a manageable state. You can just keep going. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, however many. They look great. You barely ever see them. And here we go. So we have our sample that we made. This is a machine sewn edge banding on one of the signature wet mold kits, which, thank you guys, these sold out in like less than a week. So we're gonna make more. Buckeye's working on it, but thank you so much for the support. That's always just such an awesome thing. We also have edge banding on a hair-on hide or a suede or something like that. This is a really nice way to finish off an edge on something that you otherwise, it's very hard to finish edges on. And then of course you have just the full hand-done edge banding with epi and Saffiano and all that good stuff. Now I do want to point out in the end here, this is what I was talking about. You can see this curve, which is done by hand, and this curve is tighter. But at the same time, this curve is about the same right here. And this is hammered down, but it is a little bit more lumpy before it's hammered down. It's a little more difficult. This is glued on and stitched with a machine. This was done by hand just now, which is why I kind of like this to begin with. And I'm still learning on this on the machine, so take that with a grain of salt. But everything by hand here takes a long time, but it's really not technically difficult once you've done it a few times. Practice, get the right measurements for you with the leather thickness that you want to use, with the core you want to use, the core leather and the piping thickness, the distances between the stitch lines, etc. And you'll find a good look. You know, you can do a nice balanced edge binding. You can do sort of a more chunky one. You can do a thicker thread. You got plenty of options. So thank you guys so much for watching. Hope you have a good time doing your own edge binding. It goes well with piping. And I'll see you in the next one.